whatever I might have felt growing up with him about him not being around, as all kids would, I had a realization one day. That realization was that if you calculate my dad's life in terms of years not spent under military occupation, he's a boy of 6.
Now, Netanyahu has announced that Israel is going to invade and seize the whole of Gaza and to force its surviving population into the south. That's better known as a concentration camp, where the survivors will be left with a decision to leave or to die. This is the logical next step of what has always been a genocide. Israeli leaders and officials have not gone to any effort to hide their intentions from day one. And yet, of course, our media and political elite have whitewashed, defended, legitimized, cheerleaded, obviously in the case of governments, armed, one of the great, most heinous crimes of our age. Now, I'm really delighted to be joined by the brilliant Kieran Andrieu, who is a British Palestinian political economist, someone I've been wanting to talk to for a very long time, actually. A very eloquent champion of justice, who's gone on TV and argued with some pretty gruesome individuals, I have to say. But I'm someone is I always say, and I say this before I start recording, you know, it was always important to remember, however angry me and many people watching who aren't of Palestinian heritage get, the emotional labor of having to just the last year and a half is pretty unimaginable. So I always appreciate when I ask people with Palestinian heritage to talk, that it's an ask, and so I'm really honoured to be joined by you, Kieran. So great to speak to you.
Thanks, Owen. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak, and thanks for asking me on.
But before I talk about just the current horror, I just want to talk about just a bit of context setting, because I mean the personal is political, and your family has lived through the atrocities that Israel has committed against the Palestinian people. Your grandfather was in the Nakba, I understand. So you just want to tell me a bit about that, because it really it is fascinating in its own right, but it fleshes out kind of that kind of context of what the Palestinian people have suffered for generations now.
Yeah, thanks, Owen. So I think that's right, and I think that, just briefly before I go into the specifics, you can trace Palestinian history very, very closely through the lives of the generations of Palestinians who have lived under Israeli occupation since 1948. Now, again, you could sort of say something broadly like that about any country. Of course, we're all part of our nation's story, etc., etc. But I think Palestinians have been forcibly reduced to political, indeed colonial subjects, and we are so much more than that. But of course, you know, the political context is inescapable to a degree, and I think that's why it's useful to kind of talk about family histories and heritage and so on. So let's get into it. Well, my grandfather, my father's father, so my dad is Palestinian, right? My mum's not. My dad's Palestinian. My dad's dad, a guy called Ahmed, was 24 years old when the Nakba arrived in 1948, beginning of 1948. And there wasn't anything like a kind of central organizing principle in Palestinian society sufficient that there would be conscription or anything like that to try and resist the kind of paramilitaries that eventually went on to form the IDF, and that's something we'll talk about later. But the paramilitaries that terrorized Palestinians, that presided over the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, there wasn't anything like a kind of organizing structure sufficient that there was a kind of conscription mechanism in place. So everybody that resisted that was a volunteer. My grandfather, as I say, was 24. He volunteered pretty much as soon as the call was made. And he went and fought, and I think lasted a couple of months. And somewhere, I won't go into, loads and loads of expansive historical detail, but eventually he was, a couple of months in, shot in the head at distance by a member of the Palmach, Palmach, which was the kind of military wing of the Haganah, which again was one of the paramilitaries which went on to form constituent part of the IDF. So my grandfather was shot in the head, a 24-year-old guy. He was taken to a field hospital nearby, so essentially just a tent in the middle of a field outside of Yaffo. And he was treated there by the Red Crescent. The resources that they had at their disposal were paltry. And in order to patch up the wound, I mean, it's at this point, anybody listening to this will be like, well, he was shot in the head and he isn't dead already. I mean, he survived. And part of the reason he survived was because the Red Crescent fought on their feet and they managed to stitch him up. But the resources, as I say, were so poor that they had to stitch a piece of literal plastic under his skull. Sorry, it's a bit gruesome. A bit of plastic under his skull and send him back. And actually, when he was in the field hospital, the Palmach turned up again to try and kill him and others in the beds in the field hospital. He escaped. He went to Jerusalem. He survived the Nakba. He went on to have 13 children. Wouldn't be my first choice, but went on to have 13 children. And one of those was, of course, my dad. My dad said that his dad, who I never met, by the way, he died in 1998. So he lived 50 years after the Nakba with a bullet wound in the head. But after that incident, my grandfather was never quite the same again. And he was able to live, a relatively fulfilled life, went on to become a taxi driver in Jerusalem. Children, was a beloved family man, etc., etc. But he wasn't quite the same again. And actually, a gruesome detail, every time he breathed, you could see the bit of plastic. They never managed to properly remove it from his head because it was too risky, causing brain damage, etc. You could see it move every time he breathed for the rest of his life.
Wow.
That's my grandfather. His eldest son, my dad's eldest brother, was part of that generation of Palestinians in the 70s that benefited from the kind of radicalism of Yasser Arafat and the PLO and Fatah in the 1960s, right? So again, I don't know but Arafat basically, the end of the Arafat story is a very depressing one. He falls prey to, corruption and so on. And the last kind of 10, 15 years of Arafat's life, he fell out with Edward Said. They'd previously been friends, etc. But in the 60s and 70s, I think it's important to emphasize that Arafat was a very important symbol of resistance and, some of the kind of substantive resistance that he led for the Palestinians was genuine resistance and genuinely impactful. And it's in that context that my uncle joined the PLO and was involved with the PLO for around 10 years. And again, I don't know exactly what happened here. None of us does. But one day he went missing. He was disappeared. And he had quite a high profile. And we knew that the Israeli government had a file on him and that they'd been following him and so on and so on. So one day he went missing. So we can say he was disappeared, I think. And of course, he had children, outstanding questions for them, which they'll live with for the rest of their lives. For my family, etc., very painful reality. And then my generation. So my brother, I'm the first of 7 children, but I have 6 siblings. They're my half siblings, and they all live in East Jerusalem. And the eldest of those is my brother, who is a couple of years younger than me. And he was first incarcerated and put into the Israeli prison industrial complex when he was 12 years old.
Wow.
He was imprisoned initially for throwing stones at tanks. So, he grew up in East Jerusalem, right? We'll talk about the apartheid, traffic light nature of apartheid and so on in a bit, I'm sure. But if you're an East Jerusalemite, you're kind of the superior inferior, right? You obviously Gazans have lived at the sharp end of everything, even in a Palestinian context. In the West Bank, people have far fewer rights than my family have had in East Jerusalem, right? They're Palestinian Muslims, and they are absolutely second, third, fourth class citizens relative to Israelis, but they have had more historic freedoms, more ability to travel than their counterparts in the West Bank and certainly in Gaza. My brother was, I suppose, inherently very political from a young age. Actually, he's kind of an exception in that sense to his generation in my family. And all of this is a long way of saying that he felt, even though he had freedoms, he felt infuriated. His friends in nearby villages didn't. So he went and joined them and threw stones at tanks when he was 12. And in that context, it's for that initial reason that he was first arrested and thrown into Israeli prison. Now, I've never met him because he spent the rest of his life, he's now 33 years old, and he spent the rest of his life in and out of Israeli prisons. And sometimes, and you know, he's developed schizophrenia, and they won't treat him. They won't do anything about it. I don't know. I've never talked about this with my dad, and maybe I never will. I mean, he might see this, but we've never talked about it. But we know, Owen, I mean, you and I know, and millions of people know what Israelis in prison do to Palestinian prisoners. So, yeah, it's obviously a huge open wound, and we don't know where it ends because he comes out for a short period of time, he goes back in. The Israelis find a reason to put him back in prison. I'll give you one example. Where my dad lives in East Jerusalem, there is a massive Israeli flag billowing from a pole above the building. And in that building, 99% of the residents are Palestinian. 99% of the residents are Palestinian. The state of Israel, the IDF, put that flag up there so that when you drive into Jerusalem and you look to the east, you see this massive Israeli flag. You don't see any Palestinian flags, even though it's a Palestinian neighborhood, even though it's internationally recognized as a Palestinian neighborhood, and probably 97% of the residents are Palestinian. But all you see is a giant Israeli flag, like triumphantly billowing above the buildings. And of course, that's a sort of symbolic engineering. It's to give the impression that it's Israeli, and it's to, inculcate the Palestinians with the sense that it's Israeli and so on. So my brother one time came out of prison, and within days of coming out of prison, this thing had gone up while he was in prison, and he said, I'm going to remove it. So he climbed onto the roof of the building and he climbed up the flagpole and he tried to remove the flag, and they threatened to shoot him, and then they took him and they put him back in prison. So I don't think he's always, he's very damaged now. He's very damaged. I don't think he's always heroic, but I think he often is. And so that's my brother. One of my sisters was shot by a member of the Israeli police. She's only 31 years old. She was shot in the middle of the night by an Israeli police officer when they were raiding my dad's house, claiming to look for somebody that none of them had ever heard of. We don't even know if they really existed. Raiding the house, and one of the officers broke my father's neck with the barrel of a machine gun while he was protesting. Of course, someone bursts into your house in the middle of the night, you've got family there, you say, what the fuck are you doing? And he was remonstrating with them, and one of them responded with that. And my sister, of course, ran towards him to try and protect him, and that was when she was shot. She's fine. She's survived. She's runs her own business and so on, and she doesn't like to dwell on things, but it's just part of their day-to-day reality, and it's part of the family story here. And just to say this, Owen, what's remarkable about all of this, it's tempting to think that my family is uniquely cursed. Of course it is. It's almost comforting to think that my family is uniquely cursed and that other people aren't going through this. But what's really astonishing and actually really painful and disturbing is the knowledge that this is unremarkable for Palestinians. This is unremarkable. There are every Palestinian you could possibly speak to, whether they're like me, relatively privileged members of the diaspora, whether they live in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, of course, Gaza is a totally different level. I mean, they will all be able to tell you stories like this related to their own humble family trees, own families, etc., etc.
I mean, a really gripping and hideous example of the violence perpetrated by the Israeli state generation after generation. And for those who don't know, just listening to that, an estimated 40% of Palestinian men in the West Bank have been arrested. But and you mentioned obviously your 12-year-old brother. And again, for those who don't know, Israel is the only country on earth which systematically puts children through a military court system. And Save the Children did a really gruesome report, which was, I would know, earlier on in 2023, months before 7th of October, which described physical and sexual abuse perpetrated against Palestinian children who had been incarcerated in the Israeli prison system. Just truly hideous barbarism. I mean, today, because I'll ask you about the West Bank as well, obviously. I mean, and what's been happening there since, not obviously before 7th of October, but the intensification of that since 7th of October. In terms of Gaza today, I mean, I started by talking about the latest plan is it feels like a really clinical euphemism for what is genocide, and different stages of genocide. I mean, that's the point. Genocide is obviously a process. It's a dynamic. And this is the stage we're at. What's your take on when you heard what Netanyahu, what had been proposed yesterday, in terms of what the plan is? What's your analysis, I guess?
Well, I hate to say this, but I wasn't the least bit surprised, and that makes me sound like a kind of mixture of somebody who's always been predetermined in their view that, you know, this is going to happen and so on, and also that, you know, somebody who's kind of fundamentally fatalistic about these things, and that's not true. I've been hopeful for Palestine my whole life, and I still am, and we'll come on to that later. But we're in a very, very dark moment. We're in a very dark night, and for those of us who have been clear-eyed about the nature of the state of Israel and about the mission underpinning the nature of the state of Israel, it doesn't come as that much of a surprise. I mean, look, sorry to do the long historical thing, but I think
it's important context. It's important to put it in that context.
When in 1948, when Israel declared itself independent on the 15th of May, 1948, and afterwards it continued to fight wars and so on with neighbors and Palestinians, it didn't stop at the borders of the Gaza Strip, and it didn't stop at the borders of the West Bank and say, okay, lads, we've had our fun. This is our state. Let them have this. This is theirs. Right? I know it sounds glib to say that, but, you know, I think there's this sense that there's always been this respect, even if there are settlements, there's this fundamental respect for a kind of future, you know, two-state solution, whatever. Actually, they were brought to a standstill. Is all that happened, and the only reason that those borders exist where they do is that they were the points where the Israeli proto-military, the militias, and then later the IDF, they couldn't advance beyond those points because of neighboring Arab armies and because of Palestinian resistance and so on. That was always considered in Israeli society to be a failure, and it was always considered to be an embarrassment, and it's always considered to be something that exists on borrowed time, those territories being Palestinian, right? And that they'll make up for that sooner or later. And it's just a question of when. So the hourglass has always been turned on its head in my mind. And the only way that we were ever going to stop this kind of outcome was by bringing Israel to heel through the economy, through international solidarity, through Palestinian resistance, etc., etc. It was never going to be. I'm sorry to say this. I wish, and for a long time, actually, when I was growing up, I really believed otherwise. Well, I sort of believed otherwise. It was never going to be, realistically, by appealing to the sensibilities and the consciences of Israelis, not because individual Israelis are inherently evil or they're just people. But because the originating mission of the State of Israel was so totally committed to the eradication or latterly the destruction of Palestinians, but it was absolutely necessary to build a massive fear-based propaganda machine that inculcated generation after generation of Israelis into being obedient to those objectives, right? And so it was never going to come from within Israeli society. And Norman Finkelstein, he's kind of, but he's got a good line on this, or at least he used to. I haven't heard him say it for a long time. He used to say it would be absurd to try and appeal to the kind of the better angels of the nature of people in the Confederate South, the Deep South, in the sort of Jim Crow years. It's fine to have those people be sort of white allies from those places on your side, and of course they're a minority, vanishingly small now, unfortunately. There are incredibly brave Israelis who march and join with Palestinians and have.
Like there was some white South Africans, but there's an overall. Yeah,
exactly. And like there were some people, Southerners, in the Deep South during Jim Crow years, who opposed what was going on, who opposed Jim Crow, who opposed the lynching, the systematic racism, etc., etc. But to design your strategy around appealing to those people, mainlining, your resources into the conscience of those people is manifestly absurd. And so I've gone on a bit of a tangent, but I think basically this was always going to happen so long as Israel wasn't kept in check, because it was always part of the design. It was always part of the plan. Now, to speak very specifically about Gaza and what's happened in the past few days, I mean, I'm sure we'll come back to this. I mean, we could talk about this for days and days. The thing I've noticed recently is people saying that they've run out of vocabulary, that they've literally run out of words. And I'm sure you felt that. I feel it. I've felt it. I feel it right now while I talk. We run out of words because there are no words that keep pace with the rate of and the rapidity of evil being perpetrated on Palestinians in Gaza. It's just beyond human comprehension. It's what complements that horror, obviously, is that the international community, I think, has shocked some of us who maybe thought that actually, yes, Israel will do these things. Israel is fundamentally barbarous because it's founded on a fundamentally barbarous mission. But the international community surely in 2025 will find ways to oppose this, even if they're diplomatic ways, even if they're, a kind of process where they navigate, exhaust every avenue first, and then cut ties with Israel, diplomatic, economic. Surely, if you were to run one half of this, which is to say what Israel's been doing in Gaza, and hold back the other half, which is to say the international community's reaction, most of us, I think, in 2023, prior to October 7th, would have said, no, but look, if they do that, that will be crossing a red line. And yes, the US will probably continue to back Israel. They'll continue to veto things at the Security Council, and they will continue, but there will have to be, because international public opinion is arrayed against Israel, so decisively now and in favor of Palestinian justice and liberation and so on. But we would have been wrong. And I think what we've seen in the international community is almost more dispiriting to me than not what Israel's done, but because I expected Israel to do this. I'm sorry to say it. I expected it. It was a slow motion conflict. It was a slow train coming, and unfortunately it's arrived. What I couldn't have foreseen properly was the collective embodiment of total moral rot and moral failure that we have seen in the form of the international community and the international community's signal failure, utter failure to contain Israel and to even oppose what's going on, even if it's just rhetorical. Oppose what's going on. And Keir Starmer, David Lammy, they've been sort of playing this Janus-based trick, haven't they? Where the only conclusion is that it's a government with chronic cognitive dissonance or something. Because on the one hand, they'll say, "Oh, we urge X, Y, and Z. We urge restraint." While at the same time feeding the war junkie, with every narcotic it demands and making lots of money off of genocide. And when I say collective moral rot, about the international community's reaction, I was thinking about this. I've been thinking about this, Owen, and I might be wrong, but I cannot think. The only historical parallel I can think of, I'll come to it in a second. Even King Leopold in Belgium, even the Congo Free State, even King Leopold had to lie to the world about what he was doing, about the rapine, about the plundering, about the mass murder machine that he built in the Congo Free State, essentially to enrich himself privately in the early 20th century. Even he lied to the whole world. And when the world gradually found out, complicit though they were, obviously, in their own war crimes, there was international outrage. And it came from civil society. It didn't come from governments, and the governments had to respond to that. You think about, I'm sorry to go there, but you think about Nazi Germany. I mean, unfortunately, I put Israel in the category with those states now.
Well, it's committing genocide. It's a genocidal state. So
exactly, you enter a milieu, all on its own when you start to do things like that. And so Nazi Germany, what were we doing? I mean, I'm not saying it was motivated by an attempt to stop the Holocaust. Of course it wasn't. But we were at war with Nazi Germany. When I say we, I mean Britain, France. Most of Europe was at war, the United States, with Nazi Germany for all sorts of reasons. But one of them was to stop the spread of fascism. And that's what was going on with Nazi. That's how Nazi Germany was responded to by the international community. As I say, Belgium Free State had to hide it from the world. The only parallel I can think of in terms of collective moral rot is maybe the Irish famine and the way in which the British government openly suppressed supplies and actually made a virtue of it. Said, using Malthusian logic, etc., there's too many people there. Some of them need to die.
I think there's a lot in that. I think, and it's a really interesting case. You're right. I mean, there's a brilliant book called King Leopold's Ghost for those who haven't read it, which goes through the horrors of what happened there. And it was suppressed. They didn't have social media. They didn't have people with mobile phones on social media live streaming what happened to them. And it was much easier, therefore, at the time, the literacy was lower, what could be reported, what access, travel was difficult. So what actually happened there, I mean, Jack Conrad wrote about it in Heart of Darkness, was fictionalized based on the depravity. But the point is, this is a live stream genocide, so there's just no excuse. We could see from day one in real time what was happening, which is quite unlike, it's not like we've seen most atrocities, because most atrocities, obviously people aren't just there with their mobile phones and then able to transport it, but we've seen more than enough. And it's such an important, that's what makes this so, it is unique. I mean, what is there as a comparison? The most documented crime, the most confessed to crime as it's happened. That point, just before I ask us about the Western states, in terms of kind of that, what's kind of inherent in the Israeli project, I guess. There's this quote here from an Israeli politician. We'd all like to wake up one spring morning and find that 7 million Palestinians who live between the sea and the river have simply disappeared. That's Yair Golan, and who is the leader of the so-called progressive opposition to Benjamin Netanyahu, the Democrats. I mean, that's instructive. Isn't that the point, that the kind of sliding scale there is everyone agrees, like, the Palestinian people are an existential issue or threat or an obstacle or a problem. And the question is, what is politically possible and permissible at any given time? So you work backwards from that point. We'd like to get rid of them, but there's a case of, well, how can we do that? We can't get away with that. So there's a question of basically what, Yair Golan would go, well, look, it's not politically feasible. He's not doing a moral objection there. He's saying, yes, ideally we get rid of all of them. But what is possible? And so that's the point, isn't it? Is what's, because you got, people who've the kind of genocide deniers will say, well, if Israel wanted to commit genocide, they could have killed everyone in one day. No genocide that's never happened in history. It's the question is what is possible at any given moment, and you work backwards from that point.
Yeah, and the sorry to go back to the end of the last point, but that the examples we have now talked about, Congo Free State is an example of that. You don't just, people seem to think, genuinely, some Zionists obviously are bad, most of them are bad faith. Some of them seem to think that a genocide is literally you drop the bomb and you wipe everyone out, and that's the only thing that meets the criteria.
Yeah, which has never happened.
Never happened once. It's never happened. So, and as we said, tremendous lengths were gone to by King Leopold and other Gauls in history, purveyors of genocide, to cover up their crimes. And it's always been in the nature of the state of Israel to cover up the crime. Actually, there was a giant apparatus that was built for that very purpose, and it was called Hasbara. In the Hebrew, Hasbara roughly translates as teaching or explaining, and it is roughly synonymous with propaganda, right? But it's a very comprehensive, very sophisticated, well-oiled propaganda machine that encompasses it's propaganda very widely understood. So it's not just comms or whatever public relations. It's also making sure that embassies around the world, that political leadership around the world is on side. It's lobbying as much as anything else. It's lobbying as well as the come to Tel Aviv. We have the best clubs in the world. We have the best beaches, etc., etc. It's both of those things. So the sort of soft Hasbara, the hard Hasbara. And Nakba happened. 750,000 Palestinians were displaced, and many thousands of tens of thousands of Palestinians were killed. And ever since, we can go through the episodes, but there have been Israeli-Palestinian history has been punctuated with many atrocities perpetrated by Israel, right? And through all of that, the mission of Hasbara, the aim, the sole raison d'etre, the objective of Hasbara was to basically cover up the crime, was to kick mud over the body, and to try and direct people's attention elsewhere. And it was very, very effective. It was very effective for a long time. It started to change, and this is an important point. What changed it was Israel. What changed public opinion turned it gradually, and it's still an ongoing process, turned it against Israel. It was Israel. That's not to say that Palestinian resistance hasn't been admirable. There's the line from Cat on the Hot Tin Roof. What's the accomplishment of the cat on the hot tin roof? It's just staying up there. The fact it can stay up there is enough, right? That's its challenge, and that's its ambition. And the fact that the Palestinians have stayed up there, so to speak, that we've stayed high up the agenda, that we've kept ourselves visible, that we haven't allowed ourselves to be swept into the ash can of history and, turned into this inconvenient, whatever, figment of the past, is a massive, massive accomplishment. And it was totally against the odds. And Palestinians throughout the past 80 years, deserve huge praise for that accomplishment alone. However, it's also true to say that nobody has been a better recruiter to pro-Palestine sentiment than the state of Israel itself. And we could have had a Che Guevara. We could have had a Martin Luther King. We could have had a Nelson Mandela or a Malcolm X. Nothing we could have done as Palestinians. None of those kind of figures in Palestinian form could have held a candle to the recruitment power of the state of Israel for pro-Palestine sentiment. Because as you have this kind of this gradual realization of the mission of the state of Israel, which is to, as I say, displace all Palestinians, as reflected in your quote just now, displace all Palestinians, in their place create a homogenous ethno-supremacist Zionist state. As you have a collision of that gradually coming into fruition as a mission, as a goal, with the dawn of social media, the advent of social media, and the kind of horizontalization of communications across societies and so on, as those two forces collide, people just say, Sabran Shatila, killing of refugees in 82, gradually, before social media, of course, but a different kind of, the early dawn of a new kind of media. 2008, 2009, so-called Operation Cast-Lead, the killing of over 1,500 Palestinians, 70% of them children. Again in 2012, again in 2014, again now, of course, with a genocide. People look at that, they say, I don't like that shit. Most people say, I don't want to be associated with that. And I certainly don't want to fund it. I certainly don't want to be, my government that I, in some cases, helped elect, I don't want them to be backing it. And so as that has happened, gradually public opinion has naturally realized that Israeli Hezbollah is bullshit.
I mean, that's what's so interesting, isn't it? Because there has been that huge shift. And if you look at British public opinion, 70% think Israel is committing war crimes. A large majority support a total arms embargo on Israel. Most want Benjamin Netanyahu arrested for war crimes and crimes against humanity. It was over 50%, according to a YouGov poll back in a few months ago. And yet, Western states remain completely committed to defending the state of Israel as it commits genocide. I mean, in Britain, you saw 8% of arms deals suspended, which the government basically bent over backwards and apologised over. And it was clear that it was only under kind of legal compulsion, basically. I mean, how do you explain that dynamic? How do you explain it, even now when you have that shift? I mean, Labour lost two shadow cabinet ministers in large part because of Gaza, because of that genocide. Yeah. So it's not like they've actually suffered some price. Why? In the Joe Biden. Maybe that's the clue. In the 1980s, he said in 1986 in Congress, he said if Israel didn't exist, the US would have to invent it. It's the best X billion dollars we've ever spent. And he was talking about it as a strategic point. He wasn't making a moral point about a Jewish homeland or something like that. What is it though? I mean, is it just? Do you think? Because of its strategic worth in the Middle East as the kind of sentinel of the West? What is it?
Well, I think it's a couple of things. I think first of all, Keir Starmer's government. So there's a kind of local cause, and then there's a kind of broader cause. So I'll start with the local one. In Keir Starmer, in the case of the current government, in the government we have right now, and of course the Tories, I'm not going to pretend the Tories are better on this. In many cases, they are worse, at least in rhetoric, or at least consistent with Starmer. But in Starmer's case, expecting Keir Starmer to break with anything that the US does, even Ukraine, even that whole thing was very carefully stage managed so that Keir Starmer could have his kind of big Churchillian moment here and still be in full deference to Trump and, the US line on Ukraine. Obviously, clearly that was carefully choreographed. On Palestine, expecting Keir Starmer to break with the US and the US's approach to Israel and to Palestine, you might as well. It's like waiting for Godot. It's not gonna happen. It's not gonna materialize. Yeah. Keir Starmer is fundamentally unimaginative. He is fundamentally. Can I say this? He's fundamentally cucked by the United States. He's also somebody who. And that's just the nature of the government he's created. And he's got people around him who are of the same mind as him. Morgan McSweeney. I mean, I don't know what Morgan McSweeney's politics are. I shared a taxi with him once, many, many years ago, but we didn't really speak to each other. It was after some Labour Party thing. And I don't know what his politics are, but I can infer from the kind of the output we've had, the policy output we've had, the kind of rhetoric we've had since 2021, that he is somebody who would take the Churchill line on this. Churchill famously said, when somebody talked about the creation of the state of Israel and the displacement of Palestinians, he said, Who gives a shit about a bunch of, and then I won't say the word, but a racist word to describe people from the Middle East? And I'm not saying that Morgan McSweeney would say that word, but I think his general view is why would we break with the US-Israeli compact for a bunch of Palestinians? I mean, it doesn't make any sense for him as far as he's concerned. That's the first thing. They're a deeply immoral group of people.
Mm.
The second thing is, I think that because they're a deeply immoral group of people, but they're also, as I said, fundamentally unimaginative. And you often find this with Keir Starmer. He's like actually behind the public on a whole multitude of issues, right? You know, whether it's nationalisation or whatever, various natural monopolies.
Yeah, taxing the rich, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Exactly. They're always playing catch up. And clearly what happened in 2020, 2021 was they said to themselves, right, we're the cleverest people in the room. That bunch of trots tried to do this. It was too radical, too left wing. Let's be really, really conservative and just assume that the country is really conservative on every single issue. And they did it in like such a kind of plaster cast, homogenous way, unimaginative, unbespoke, incapable of picking out nuance, incapable of doing mix and match in any kind of intelligent, sophisticated way. So they are stuck now, and I think you see it on their faces increasingly. I mean, with reform winning and so on, you know, you can see that they put themselves into a straitjacket, and every time they're outflanked to the left by reform or the Greens or whoever it is, Morgan McSweeney cuts off the, you know, they get rid of some public-facing politician, and McSweeney says, I never wanted that in the first place. It was an aberration whose origin is this person that we've now got rid of, right? I think that you could extend that to foreign policy. So, you know, actually there's a wider point here, which is that public opinion, as I keep banging on about, has shifted. And I keep banging on about it, by the way, I'll talk about it maybe in a bit, because it's the only thing that gives us hope as people who care about Palestine. But as public and as Palestinians, but as public opinion has shifted, the dial shifted toward a pro-Palestinian, pro-justice position on it and against Israel, you know, presently constituted. There is this attempt that there is this kind of sluggishness. There's this sluggishness of institutions to respond to it. You know, politicians, if they want to try and reflect it. I don't think Palestine defines elections in this country still, by the way. I don't agree with that. I don't think we're there yet. But it might be 4 or 5 topics down the list in terms of things that people vote on, or even 6 or 7 or 8. But I do think that when you do isolate that one particular topic, the majority of people are broadly at least discomforted by what they see coming out of Gaza, at the least, and many of them are much more strident in their pro-Palestine positions. So that's an electoral question, but I think institutions have been sluggish to respond to that shift in public opinion. They haven't really, even if you look at it in a kind of strategic sense, they haven't really picked up on the fact that there are strategic gains there to be had by being a kind of, you know, consistently anti-imperialist, not necessarily openly anti-Zionist, but, you know, critical of what Israel's doing and so on. That's the second thing, but that's kind of like something about institutional inertia. I think more than either of those things, I still think that there is a very powerful lobby that, you know, clusters around Israel and that basically is very carefully directed into places to make it very difficult for politicians to change their position on this kind of question, to keep up with the times, to react to what they're seeing, to react to what their constituents want. There is this kind of a penumbra around the state of Israel that is very, and by the way, before, you know, I know that we've kind of moved on from this discourse now, not many of them aren't Jewish. Many of them aren't Jewish. You know, they're professionals, they're evangelical Christians. They have, even if they're not directly evangelical Christians, they certainly have their bases in evangelical Christian heartlands in the United States and so on. So this isn't a thing about, Jewish conspiracy or anything shadowy like that. This is about an ideology. This is about protecting a nation state that's committing genocide. And this is about the arms industry. And this is about business interests connected to that genocide, the profiteering and so on. Those are the constituent parts of that lobby. And of course, there is a strong, ideological Zionist element there as well, or ethno-Zionist, kind of ethno-supremacist element there too. But it's mottled, it's mixed. And I think really the first two explanations are interesting, a bit academic, but interesting. This is the key, that though there is still this kind of very, and actually I think mentioned Hasbara, propaganda, that there's a relationship there, that as global public opinion has shifted against what the State of Israel does and has been doing to the Palestinians for 80 years, many who manage the Hasbara machine, the propaganda machine, as I say, it's broadly understood, have said, we're going to shift resources. We're going to put resources that were previously in the kind of soft Hasbara category or basket into the hard Hasbara basket. In other words, move it away from tourism, move it away from trying to, messages in whatever, and move it towards traditional comms PR, move it towards the harder, the kind of compellence stuff or the impellence stuff. So get our guys in the embassies, get our guys in the media spaces, get our guys in lobbying government, and so on and so on.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about is about the media. I watched a clip which made a bit of an impact online, which was when you were debating Jake Wallace-Simons, who's the former editor of the Jewish Chronicle, and I think it's fair to say a pretty militant apologist for Israel and the horrors, actually, which have been inflicted, obviously, on the Palestinian people since 7 October. What I just wanted, just that kind of, I mean, obviously, just how anti-Palestinian racism is so normalized. There's not actually any pretense in any meaningful way that Palestinian life has even a fraction of the worth of an Israeli life, or those deemed to be us, Westerners, because Israelis basically just subsumed into the us category. They're Westerners, they're us, Palestinians are them. And just how, the kind of narrative really, which has just been immune, like it's like titanium enforced, which is broadly along the lines of Israel is conducting a war of self-defense, and we can have a debate about whether its response is proportionate or not, and we can agree to disagree on that. That's, basically it's just kind of as every possible conceivable horror and crime is committed. And you do occasionally get, and I've noted this before, you do get occasional, so I'm nuanced, Western media deconstructions of Israeli lies. So, for example, recently on the paramedics butchered and left in a mass grave by the Israeli state, Sky News did a deconstruction. The Washington Post have done one about, for example, the assault on Al-Shifa Hospital in November 2023. CNN once did one about the Flower Massacre and so on. But the issue is you get these occasional good pieces of journalism. They're good pieces of journalism, but they're obviously far too few of them. B, they're too late. They come after the event. And 3, they're detached from the wider narrative. They're siloed. You don't then get a kind of like Russian authorities are treated by the Western media. You don't defer to what they say is somehow credible. You just treat them as risible, basically. What do you think about that? Just the way across the board that Western media approach is just immune to anything that happens. Like, what does Israel have to do at this point? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, totally. And I think the answer to that is there is, and this is the sad truth, there is nothing at present that they can do that will shift that discourse within the upper reaches of the media. So from editors, from the really powerful guys that decide how the shows or the newspapers are going to lead. There's nothing Israel can do that will shift that right now. I mean, they could. I think I'm firm in my belief that they could drop a nuclear bomb on Gaza, and there would be, of course, shock, and they would use it to fill column inches and make stories for days and days. But I still think, broadly speaking, they would find a way to justify it. at present. That doesn't mean it's always going to be like that. I mean, yeah, Owen, you're a journalist. You know, I'm sure that there are lots of journalists who want to report this properly, who are disgraced, but or is that not your experience?
I think it's, do you know what? This is something I think about actually a lot, because it's easy to just get angry at those who still legitimize and cheerlead for Israel's doing, like Dan Hodges. Like, you just, at this point, I just think sociopathic. It's the people who are silent. And these are the people who, they'll do some hand wringing. They'll hand wring about, oh, it's terribly, oh, but they won't call out a crime for what it is. Like, if it was a state which was hostile to the West. These are the same people who think they're being courageous when they tweet condemning Vladimir Putin, who is where there's a media consensus on that. Our countries are arming and backing Ukraine. I mean, it's just what are you doing? What, I'm not saying you shouldn't condemn what's happening in, war crimes in Ukraine. What the issue is, you're not adding anything. You're not doing anything. Like, what's the impact of that? There's no, you're not. What are you trying to secure there? Like, an angry tweet. Oh, Vladimir Putin's going to back down in the Kremlin. But on the issue of this, you do require a backbone, because I get it, but you're a coward. I mean, at the end of the day, and every atrocity in history has always been made possible by those people. It's journalists, and I get sometimes I have a journalist who comes to me going like, "Well, Dylan, you're saying what a lot of us think. Fucking say it then." I just think that's the issue. It's just, those people need to be condemned. They need to be shamed. And you're right, they do. You're right. People do want to report on it, but it's not just. You're right. There's an institutional issue. That's absolutely correct. I get that within their media outlets. I've interviewed BBC. I did a report about the systemic issues in the BBC, and I interviewed BBC journalists, 13 of them, who were whistleblowers and who told me the inside story of what's happening. In the BBC, and they're fighting as best they can to report stories. So that's, that is happening, but it is people basically who just don't want to touch it, not in a meaningful way, and they're doing it because they fear, not by the way irrationally, that the impact on their career, or they'll get somehow deplatformed or smeared online. Those are clear risks. If you speak out about Palestine, there's the most intense assault on free speech since the 1950s, since McCarthyism, no question. But you're not getting a bomb dropped on you along with your entire family like Palestinian journalists, and that's why they're risible. Right,
exactly. And so what you see, I think, is then a sort of cowardly middle. In other words, you've got people, like yourself, and the guys at Novara and various others. Of course, there are some notable exceptions in the middle within institutions, but generally speaking, you've got you guys, and then you've got people at the very top, like Gary Lineker and Louis Theroux. Gary Lineker's not a journalist, obviously, but he was
a sports journalist, but not a news journalist. Yeah.
More journalist. It turns out he's got more journalistic integrity in his little finger than Amaraj does in his whole body. But anyway. You've got those guys at the very top, the Louis Theroux's, the Gary Linekers, who are really, really rich, and they basically don't need to worry about money ever again.
They're national institutions in their own right.
National institutions. They've already made tens of millions or millions and millions of quid. They're fine.
So it's like, come at me, bro. Whatever.
Yeah, exactly. What are you going to do? And Gary Lineker's got his Goal Hanger podcast thing going on, which is winning awards and making him shitloads of money. And
lovely guy, Gary.
Yeah, he is. He's a great guy.
Lovely guy.
Rest is history. It's a couple of libs, but I quite enjoy it. But
anyway. It's also just on that. It's just because actually he's interesting because he is. There's like liberals. The worst thing. I mean, obviously I'm a socialist, but liberals, in terms of you could, if you were like a consistent liberal, in terms of what liberalism is on paper, you would speak out against the genocide. It's just like basic liberal principles, but you don't get, there's no just, the only ones you have basically are him, Jonathan Portes, for example. He's an economist who's kind of, I suppose more towards the liberal end, but he's spoken out against the genocide. But those are examples of, you get actual liberals who aren't, you see what I mean?
Yeah. They're actually consistent with their professed principles, and this is and we can talk about that again in a minute in the context of the international community, because I'll come back to the original point. But I think liberals and the Keir Starmers of the world, and all those guys, their failure their abject failure on this question, on Gaza, to protect Gaza, to rein Israel in, etc., committing war crimes and genocide, will have catastrophic consequences for the so-called rules-based international system. And it already is. And, it's always been very, very shaky and tenuous anyway. But it is, I think, this has signed its death warrant, basically. And so all of the liberals who claim they cared about and often wheel it out with Russia, with Ukraine, and say, look, this is a disgrace because of it. There'll be a laughter track. People will help them, figuratively speaking, with rotten fruit and vegetables, because they have completely and utterly slain their professed sacred cow in the form of the international rules-based community and international legality and all the rest of it. All those edifices that were, as I say, shakily erected after World War II, they've often functioned in service of power and not in the service of those in the global south or those arrayed against power. But, for better or for ill, they were there. And actually with the ICC has tried to carry that flame. It's tried to carry that torch. It's tried to do its fucking job.
It really has, yeah.
It's the self-professed architects of international rules-based order that have completely chopped it down, retrenched it, shown themselves to be completely contemptuous of international law by allowing Netanyahu and members of his government to fly through the airspace, to land on their soil, etc. I mean, it's just there's no going back on this now. Nobody will ever take any of them seriously ever again on international law or the rules-based international system of norms and so on. That's just a separate point. But I think, look, to answer your question really directly, and I think you've actually helped me crystallize my answer to it, why the media is doing it. There's three reasons. One is credentialism, that journalists want access, and they know the game, they know the court, and they know the court games very, very well. And so, they know that they can be a genuine gadfly, to use this Socratic term. They can genuinely oppose or ask questions. They don't even need to oppose. They can ask probing questions, as journalists are supposed to do. They will be cut out, and Keir Starmer's government, I think, has showed itself to be quite spiteful, maybe even more than average on that front. So journalists, there's credentialism. Journalists want access, and they know they won't get it if they start saying searching things about Israel. There's also the groupthink thing, which I said sort of Starmer's government was an embodiment of, and other governments in this country in the past, and many governments and political system. But there's a media groupthink as well. I mean, I haven't spent that much time in television studios, and you will have spent infinitely more time. But you do, when you speak to some journalists, some of them extremely storied and prestigious and educated, in the small amounts of time that I've spent in those spaces, I have thought on occasion, God, these people are really, really unimaginative and really uninteresting, and they're really not interested in ideas or the truth. They are really hardwired almost to just know how to do the ABC of journalism, get the story out, make the mothership happy, and then continue to gain access to the key players, and then rinse and repeat, right? And that's the secret of their success. So there's that. Then obviously that fuses with the credentialism point, but it's groupthink, but that creates a certain way of thinking, right? That creates a certain way of thinking. It's not that they're just lying to themselves all the time. It's that why would they peer over their hedges? Why would they peer over their suburban hedges at the horror show, at the starvation camp? It's never served them, so they don't even think to look. It's not that they're. So there's those two things, and then I come back to the point about the kind of more external factor, the lobbying. And you've talked about it. That's why I say you get the Louis Theroux's, the Gary Linekers, the people who really have made their life's work and who are minted, and as a result, they can't really. There's nothing they can really do to them. Except for tarnish try hard to tarnish their reputations in a way that doesn't really work the way it did in 2018, 2017, 2019. It just doesn't work as well anymore.
No.
Again, because of that point about the whole world can see what Israel's doing.
Absolutely.
And so you can just, it's transparent that this attempt to defame people or whatever, discredit people in the light of something so horrific. But the lobbying is still there for the middle. So you guys aren't, I don't want to say you're at the, but you guys on the left of it, you're not as touched by it. You don't give a shit. You've already been dragged through the mud a million times by these people, whatever. And then Louis Theroux, Gary Lineker, whatever. But the guys in the middle, not only are they suffering from groupthink and are, in service to credentialism or in hoc to credentialism, but they're also subject to intense lobbying, I think.
I think there's a lot in that, definitely, 100%. My mum always said, I guess what helps if you're on the left is if you picture yourself like this. My mum always said that I'm riding a lion, and one day the lion's going to throw me off and eat me. So just kind of feel a bit fatalistic about it. Just finally, in terms of just what. In terms of just anything you want to say, kind of thrown into this really, but what hope do you have as a British Palestinian looking at and having lived, through your family, as you've gone through your family history, generation after generation, suffering violence in many different forms perpetrated by the Israeli state, and as you say, that that's one case study, and every Palestinian family can tell these horrible stories. What hope do you have about how this could change? How the Palestinian people could have liberation?
Yeah, it's a question I grapple with every day and think about every day. And I know we all are, by the way. I mean, any of us with half a conscience, we're all thinking about it. It's not just Palestinians. It's not just certainly not just me. I think that. There's a couple of things, and forgive me for kind of subjecting myself to almost treating it like it's therapy or something. But
no, do treat it like that.
Appreciate that, Owen. Thank you. Look, I mean, speaking very personally, and this is the thing about something like the Nakba, it creates such enormous seismic fallout across the generations, across even the centuries, which then means that the Palestinian experience is so fragmented, right? Which is part of the logic that reproduces the state of Israel. Is that Palestinian experience is so fragmented. I wonder whether to even admit this. Sometimes, especially in the past 18 months, the being Palestinian. Even if you're a relatively privileged member of the diaspora, as I am, it's important to stress that, I think, over and over again. It feels a bit like being terminally ill. Now, I've never been terminally ill. I want to stress that. It's probably a problematic analogy, but it's the closest thing that I can think of to how I feel sometimes, seeing what I see, hearing what I hear from my family, and just feeling like the sun is setting or something, like seeing a horizon, a beautiful horizon, and seeing the sun setting and the light fading. That's how it feels sometimes to me. It also feels, by the way, like sometimes like I'm a member of one of the most beloved families in the world. And that's another thing that's really important to say that's really, really shifted, which is, and you're part of that, Owen. Sorry to say you're part of that, and obviously many, many millions of others. We know when I was growing up, you would go to a Palestine demo in London. Say, take 2002 when Ariel Sharon was flattening Jenin and Nablus, right? Go to a Palestine demo, huge event. Now it would get not wall-to-wall coverage on mainstream media, but it would have huge social media coverage. We'd probably get hundreds of thousands. It wasn't Gaza levels, but it was a real destruction of two major Palestinian urban centers and many, many killed by a man who was a war criminal who, was a fugitive from international law, died a fugitive from international law. And by the way, was instrumental, even though he was only 20 years old, in killings, systematic executions in the Nakba. Anyway, we'd come to London, my mum and I, and you'd be lucky if you got 2-3. You'd be lucky if you got 1,000 people at those demos. And we're only talking 2002. It's not very long ago. So to know that has shifted to such a huge extent in my lifetime, in my short lifetime so far, is enormous. And it does make me feel like it balances the terminally ill feeling with a feeling of being beloved and a feeling of being part of a family that is very beloved and, seen, or whatever you want to say. So that's one thing to say. I think we're gonna win this eventually. I just do, and I don't know whether that's just because I feel really despairing most days, on and off. But ultimately, I think we're going to win this. I'll give you an example. I mean, just to give you sort of political sciencey explanations, I think that there are too many pathologies in Israeli society. There are too many fundamental pathologies. There are too many fundamental antagonisms that will just get worse and worse. And I think that portends the decay of the state of Israel from within. And then, of course, the task for all of us, justice, expediting the end of racist, apartheid, genocidal, ethno-state, is to put as much pressure as possible in the economy, so through things like BDS, but also through direct action and building international coalitions and continuing to find language, Owen. This is so important because, as we said earlier, we're running out of vocabulary. We've run out of vocabulary. We've run out of language. It doesn't matter. We've got to dig deep. We've got to keep digging deep to find ways to express what we're seeing in front of us. And we can't give up on that, even if we feel like we're repeating ourselves, even if we feel like we're living through the most horrific version of Groundhog Day. We have to find ways to express this. And I'm confident that we will, even if they're not fit to, even if they're not to scale, even if they don't keep up with the pace of evil by half. I'm confident that we will continue to articulate it. And through articulation, we build international solidarity. So those are the political sciencey things. On a personal note, I'll never forget, my relationship with my dad has always been one of distance. I think he's a nice man, and I care about him a lot, and I know vice versa. We've never been that close. I didn't grow up with him. Grew up in England. And two things about him quickly, because I should mention him if I've got time. Have I got time?
Yeah, go for it.
Well, one thing was, whatever I might have felt growing up with him about him not being around, as all kids would, I had a realization one day. That realization was that if you calculate my dad's life in terms of years not spent under military occupation, he's a boy of 6. He was born in 1960. The tanks came in 67 into East Jerusalem. And even before that, he was encircled by expansionist Zionist state. But if you calculate his life in terms of, he's a boy of 6. And I swear to you, after having that realization, I've never been able to feel anything like annoyance or resentment or anything towards him again. One day, a couple of years back, we were in Jerusalem, and I think we were wandering around the neighborhood there in East Jerusalem, and he said to me, I won't make it out. I won't see a free Palestine, just so you're aware. I'm going to die before that happens. I will die under military occupation, under Zionist rule, essentially. I will die a second or third class citizen, and I won't see a free Palestine. Just so you know, I'm resigned to that now. But I'll tell you something. One day, they will be gone, and we will still be here. And he didn't mean by they Jews. He didn't mean all Jewish people. He meant people who don't want to share the land, who don't want to live with people who are different to them, who don't respect or have any regard for Palestine or Palestinian history or Palestinians or Palestinian communities. That's what he meant. He didn't explain. I didn't ask him to explain, but I could see how deeply felt that was. And somewhere between the political science, the explanations, and that faith, I think he might be right.
Well, it's a sobering place to end. But it's been such an honor, such a pleasure, honestly. I think we've covered so much, and weaving the personal in is always so important, not least when speaking to people with Palestinian heritage, when we're talking about, obviously, what has been perpetrated against the Palestinian people by the Israeli state with the full support and complicity and facilitation of Western states. And it's been so educational. I've learned a lot. It's been really just educational in every possible way. So for those watching, press like, leave comments, subscribe, but leave comments, engage. Obviously, that's what we want. Share the video. But Kieran, it's been such an honor, and thanks so much for that. Honestly, really, really appreciate it.
Oh, and thank you for having me on. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak about these things. And I do just want to say, I'm sorry to embarrass you, but I do just want to say thank you for the work that you've done as well over the years, especially latterly, but over many years. So it's much appreciated. Can't speak for all Palestinians, but I know that many feel the same way.
That's very sweet of you. And yeah, and as I said before, it's the people who should be silent, who haven't spoken out should be condemned more than those who've spoken out should be praised. But yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.
All right.